You have come to this place not by chance, but by necessity. Life has an uncanny way of guiding the soul toward the mirror it has most resisted. For the empath, that mirror has long been the face of another. The narcissist, a figure at once magnetic and merciless, whose presence awakens both devotion and despair. Yet what if I were to tell you that the true revelation is not about them at all, but about you? That every encounter with a narcissist is an archetypal drama staged by the unconscious to draw your eyes finally toward yourself? In my years studying the labyrinth of the psyche, I have seen countless souls enslaved by projection, that sacred mechanism by which we see outside what we cannot yet bear within. The empath, tender and permeable, has mastered the art of seeing the divine potential in others, but rarely in themselves. Their compassion becomes a veil for which they can no longer distinguish self from other. Thus, when the narcissist arrives grand, hungry for admiration, allergic to vulnerability, the empath is pulled into orbit, mistaking absorption for connection. The tragedy is not moral, but symbolic. The light of the empath's soul has been turned outward, leaving their own depths unlit. You see, the unconscious arranges encounters with exquisite precision. The narcissist is not merely a person, but an archetype, the image of self-inflation that compensates for inner emptiness. The empath, conversely, represents the archetype of divine receptivity, the longing to merge with something greater than ego. When these two forces collide, the universe trembles, for a cosmic equation seeks balance. The empath offers endless understanding. The narcissist demands endless reflection. Together they form a closed circuit, one giving light, the other devouring it. But hidden within that torment lies the seed of awakening, the moment when the empath's gaze, exhausted by disappointment, begins to turn inward. This turning is not gentle. It is the death of illusion. The empath, accustomed to finding meaning through saving, must now confront the abyss of their own need to be needed. They must ask, why did I choose this dance? What unhealed wound called the narcissist to my door? In that question lies alchemy. For to see oneself not as victim, but as participant, is to reclaim the lost fragments of power. The empath discovers that their boundless compassion was also a strategy, a defense born of early pain, a way to control rejection. By becoming indispensable, the narcissist simply played the role assigned by the unconscious to expose this hidden bargain. Imagine the psyche as a temple divided between light and shadow. The empath dwells in the lighted chamber, tending to every flame that flickers in others, but the cellar, beneath the place of forgotten rage, shame, and unmet desire remain locked. The narcissist descends from that cellar, carrying the denied aspects of the empath's own psyche. They embody the very traits the empath disowns: self-importance, appetite, dominance, the horror one feels toward a narcissist is the shock of seeing one's own shadow wearing another's face. And yet, only by confronting this reflection can wholeness begin. Many dreamers have brought me visions of mirrors cracking, of faces dissolving into smoke, of endless corridors lined with reflections. These are not dreams of vanity, but of individuation. When the empath finally dreams of seeing themselves truly, not through the eyes of another, the psyche celebrates. The dream announces the withdrawal of projection, the sacred return of psychic energy to its rightful owner. This moment is not triumphal but tremulous, for the self glimpsed without disguise is both luminous and terrible. To see oneself is to confront the totality, the savior and the manipulator, the giver and the thief of one's own vitality. In the language of alchemy, this stage is a nigredo, the blackening. Everything that once seemed pure now reveals contamination. Every act of love exposes hidden self-interest. The empath feels despair, believing they have lost their innocence. But I tell you, innocence must be before wisdom is born. The darkness is not punishment, but purification, the necessary chaos before the new order of the soul. The narcissist, sensing their spell, weakening, often rages or retreats, for they thrive on unexamined admiration. When the empath's vision clears, the illusion collapses. What remains is silence, and in that silence, the first heartbeat of autonomy. To see oneself truly is an act of tremendous courage. Most people prefer the comfort of projection, the certainty of blaming. It is easier to call the other toxic than to explore the inner toxicity of our own unmet longings. But the empath who dares to see recognizes that the narcissist's grandeur is a distorted echo of their own suppressed greatness. They learn that humility without self-valuation is not virtue but self-erasure. They begin to integrate strength with softness, clarity with compassion. And in doing so, they no longer attract those who feed on unclaimed light. You must understand, the narcissist's hunger is infinite because it masks a wound that can never be filled from without. The empath's giving is infinite because it avoids that same inner emptiness. They are twin expressions of the same wound, one externalizing lack through domination, the other through servitude. Healing begins when the empath stops supplying the illusion that love equals depletion. In that instant, energy that once flowed outward begins to spiral inward, nourishing the self that had been abandoned. It is then that the sacred paradox reveals itself. By ceasing to rescue, the empath rescues themselves. The light they once offered others becomes the lamp that guides them through the labyrinth. They learn the language of boundaries, which are not walls but contours of selfhood. The narcissist may call it cruelty. The empath will recognize it as truth. For the first time, the mirror shows not a distorted reflection, but a living soul, flawed, finite, yet radiant in its authenticity. When this happens, dreams change. The persecutor in the dream no longer chases but dissolves. The house, once invaded by strangers, becomes secure. The psyche, sensing integration, withdraws its symbolic alarms. Even the body responds, shoulders unclench, breath deepens, eyes brighten, for the empath has reclaimed what Jung called libido in its original sense, the creative life energy, no longer siphoned by endless caretaking. It now fuels creation, imagination, purpose. Yet the journey is not linear. There are nights when the old pattern whispers, tempting the empath back into martyrdom. The shadow does not vanish. It waits, patient, for recognition. Integration is not victory, but relationship. To see oneself is to enter ongoing dialogue with all that one has been and might still become. The narcissist, once demonized, becomes a teacher, harsh, unwilling, but necessary. They have forced you to see that love without consciousness is possession, that empathy without discernment is self-betrayal. Do not curse them, thank them. Silently, they have carried a mirror heavy with darkness, so that you might glimpse your own light. The revelation of the empath's self is not a new identity, but the recovery of wholeness. It is the moment when compassion includes the one who gives it, and in that inclusion, something miraculous happens. The narcissist loses power, not because you defeated them, but because you no longer need their reflection to exist. The revelation of the empath self is not a simple awakening, but a sacred dismantling. When the light turns inward, the first thing it illuminates is the wreckage of identification, all the roles the empath has played to feel worthy of love. The caregiver, the healer, the peacekeeper, the one who absorbs storms so that others may see sunlight, these identities, once noble, now tremble under scrutiny. The empath begins to see that what they call love was often the fear of abandonment in disguise, and what they called compassion was sometimes a form of control, an attempt to manage chaos by being indispensable within it. This recognition burns, yet in the burning lies the first true purification of spirit. In my work I have often said that what we do not make conscious will appear in our lives as fate. The empath's repeated entanglement with the narcissist is not random fate, but unconscious repetition. The psyche's insistent demand that what remains unseen be finally seen. For deep within the empath's shadow lives a child who once learned that survival depends on attunement, that love must be earned by anticipating another's need. This child still lives, still listens for danger in the tone of another's breath. The narcissist, with their unpredictable hunger, reenacts the old theater of conditional affection. Thus, the empath's giving becomes compulsive, not from virtue, but from ancient fear. Yet when consciousness enters, the script begins to crumble. The empath sees not only the other's manipulation, but their own addiction to emotional rescue. They see that their sensitivity, which once felt like a divine gift, has also been a chain keeping them tethered to the moods and wounds of others. To finally see oneself means to walk away from the need to be indispensable This walking away is not abandonment, but birth, the emergence of the autonomous soul that no longer defines itself by another's emptiness. The alchemical process continues. Having passed through nigredo, the blackening, the empath enters albedo, the whitening, the cleansing of perception. In dreams, this stage may appear as washing in water, standing in the snow, or encountering light so pure it blinds. These images speak of purification through awareness. The empath begins to perceive boundaries not as betrayal but as sacred geometry, the natural architecture of the soul. They realize that empathy without structure is dissolution, and structure without empathy is tyranny. Intégration demands both. Here, the archetype of the anima or animus becomes active, the inner counterpart of the soul that mediates between the ego and the unconscious. For many empaths, their empathy is an overdeveloped anima function, a constant reaching outward to bridge and heal. When this energy is reclaimed, it turns inward, becoming creative imagination, intuition, and self-relationship. The empath who once lost themselves in others now begins to dialogue with their own depths. They dream of meeting a luminous figure, sometimes an angel, sometimes a stranger who mirrors them not as victim or savior, but as equal. This is the soul announcing that wholeness has begun. You must understand, to see oneself is to enter the most terrifying intimacy of all, to gaze into the mirror of the psyche and meet not an ideal but the truth, the parts that manipulate, the parts that beg, the parts that hide their brilliance for safety. Only when the empath can love this truth does transformation become permanent. For love, as the alchemists knew, is the fire that unites opposites. Compassion without self-awareness is martyrdom. Awareness without compassion is cruelty. The union of the two births, what I have called the self, the totality of the psyche, both human and divine. But before this union stabilizes, the old forces resist. The narcissist, sensing their psychic function fading, often reappears in subtle ways. They might not return physically, but as an inner voice, the critic, the guilt, the doubt, whispering, "You are selfish now, you've changed." This is the internalized archetype trying to reassert control. The empath must recognize this voice not as truth but as memory, the ghost of the old pattern demanding worship. In dreams it may appear as a figure knocking on the door, or a once beloved house turning dark. Do not open that door. The psyche is testing whether the new boundaries are rooted in fear or in consciousness. Gradually, the empath learns to stand in solitude without loneliness. They discover that empathy directed inward becomes wisdom. The same intuition that once read the moods of others now reads the language of symbols, the movement of the inner world. Art, music, writing, prayer, these become vessels through which the empath communicates with their own soul. What was once external caretaking becomes internal creativity. The narcissist no longer appears as oppressor, but as initiator, the dark priest who unconsciously ordained the empath into the mysteries of selfhood. You see, the true revelation is that the narcissist was never the enemy. They were the shadow's emissary, bearing the message that you had forgotten your own divinity. When the empath finally sees themselves, the polarity dissolves. There is no longer empath and narcissist, giver and taker, victim and perpetrator. There is only energy unconscious, seeking consciousness, darkness longing for integration. And when this realization dawns, forgiveness arises naturally, not as moral superiority, but as understanding. You cannot hate the darkness once you know it was carrying the light you refused to hold. The final phase of alchemy rubedo, the reddening, is the stage of embodiment. Here, the empath begins to live their new awareness in the world. Boundaries become effortless, not rigid. Compassion flows without depletion. They attract relationships that mirror their wholeness rather than their wounds. Yet even this state is dynamic, not static. The psyche continues to spiral, refining its expression of love and individuality. The empath becomes a living bridge between worlds, between feeling and intellect, spirit and matter, shadow and light. In this embodied state, the narcissist loses symbolic power. Encounters with similar energies no longer wound. They instruct. The empath, now self-aware, can observe manipulation without merging with it, can love without losing identity. This is not detachment, but divine participation, to stand present with another's pain while rooted in one's own center. It is the fulfillment of the archetype of the healer, not as rescuer, but as consciousness itself. The empath, who once dissolved into others, now radiates presence, and presence heals without effort. When the empath finally sees themselves, they cease to seek mirrors. They become the mirror, not of egoic reflection, but of soul recognition. Those who look into their eyes see themselves not because the empath is empty, but because they are whole. The narcissist, should they appear again, finds no fuel, only stillness. For light, when it knows itself, cannot be devoured. It illuminates, and illumination dissolves illusion. When consciousness ripens, when the empath has faced their own abyss and emerged not with answers, but with awareness, something remarkable occurs. The transformation no longer belongs solely to the individual. It begins to ripple outward, touching the collective. This is the mystery of individuation, the alchemical process through which one soul's integration contributes to the healing of all humanity. Jung once said that the greatest service we can offer the world is to make the unconscious conscious within ourselves. For every empath who awakens, the ancestral chain of suffering loses one link. The empath's pain, you see, is not merely personal, it is transpersonal, a manifestation of the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who carries humanity's forgotten sorrow in their nervous system. The myth of Chiron reveals this truth, wounded by a poisoned arrow that could not be removed. Chiron devoted his immortality to learning the art of healing. Knowing he could not heal himself by ordinary means, the empath's wound is similar. They have spent lifetimes tending to the wounds of others, believing salvation lies in service, yet their own wound festers quietly beneath the act of giving. But when the empath finally sees themselves, they understand that the wound was never meant to destroy them. It was meant to reveal the medicine hidden within consciousness. This is the paradox of the healer's path. Healing does not mean erasing the wound, but sanctifying it. The empath who has integrated shadow and light no longer denies pain, but neither do they glorify it. They hold it as a chalice through which compassion flows without corruption. The narcissist, who once symbolized domination and absence of empathy, becomes a mythic messenger, an agent of initiation. In the theater of psyche, they have forced the empath to confront the extremes of self-loss, so that the empath might discover the sacred boundary of being. The individuation process unfolds like a spiral, each turn revisiting themes of selfhood, shadow, and relationship. But from a higher octave of awareness, the empath, now conscious of their inner architecture, notices that empathy can transform into clairvoyance of the soul. They begin to sense archetypes in motion, not merely personalities, but energies playing through form. The narcissist is no longer a person to fear or hate, but a pattern to be understood, a manifestation of humanity's struggle between inflation and emptiness. Seeing this frees the empath from personal bitterness and opens them to universal compassion. At this stage, dreams become luminous. The empath may dream of walking through a forest of mirrors that no longer distort but reflect endless variations of self. They may see a serpent shedding its skin, or a phoenix rising from ashes, images of renewal that mark the union of opposites. The psyche rejoices when integration nears completion, symbols of death and rebirth. Water and fire begin to merge. What was once fragmented becomes fluid, and life itself feels like an unfolding mystery rather than a battlefield of survival. This new awareness brings a profound shift in perception. Others cease to be seen as threats or saviors, but as expressions of the same divine psyche wearing different masks. The empath, who once lived in hypervigilance, now moves in serenity because they recognize projection as an invitation, not a trap. When they sense manipulation, they ask, what part of me does this reflect? When they feel admiration, they ask, what dormant quality in me seeks expression? Every interaction becomes an alchemical dialogue between inner and outer worlds. The narcissist's grandiosity is seen for what it is, a desperate plea for self-recognition from a soul starved of essence. The empath, no longer reacting, responds from the self, the center that neither inflates nor collapses. This is what it means to see oneself not merely as an ego, but as a vessel of the divine unconscious, expressing itself through matter. Individuation is not self-improvement, it is self-realization. The empath's transformation mirrors the cosmos' desire to know itself. Every tear shed in confusion becomes a drop in the river of awakening. The pain that once isolated now unites. The empath becomes an instrument of harmony. Their presence alone altering the frequency of those around them, where once they absorbed others' emotions unconsciously, they now transmute them consciously, not by effort, but by resonance. Light, integrated with shadow, becomes magnetic. The healed empath radiates coherence that reminds others of their own forgotten wholeness. Yet, we must not romanticize this transformation. It is not serenity without struggle. The journey of seeing oneself demands continual humility. The empath must vigilantly guard against spiritual inflation, the temptation to identify with the archetype of the healer or the savior once more. The moment one believes they have arrived, the unconscious finds a way to reintroduce shadow through subtle pride or messianic self-image. True wholeness carries no need to proclaim itself. It moves quietly, aware that the dance between light and dark never ends, only deepens in grace. The empath's gift after revelation is discernment, the ability to love without merging, to feel without losing center. They become artists of energy, sculptors of boundaries, knowing that every no protects the sanctity of their yes. They understand that the world's suffering cannot be swallowed whole. It must be witnessed in fragments. Each fragment met with awareness rather than absorption. This is conscious empathy, no longer reactive or compulsive, but intentional, luminous, disciplined by love. The narcissist archetype, too, evolves. When seen through consciousness, it no longer represents evil, but imbalance the soul's desperate overcompensation for self-rejection. In healing themselves, the empath heals this archetype within the collective psyche, for humanity as a whole suffers from narcissistic inflation, the worship of image, status, and control over being. The empath's awakening becomes an antidote to this cultural sickness, a living reminder that connection does not require sacrifice, and power does not require domination. When enough individuals embody this realization, society itself begins to shift from projection to introspection. This is how one person's psychological revelation becomes a spiritual revolution. The empath, once a silent absorber of pain, becomes a catalyst for consciousness in their community. They may not preach, yet their very presence invites honesty. People feel seen, not because the empath reflects them, but because the empath's gaze no longer hides. To be seen by someone who sees themselves is to be called into authenticity. This is the empath's final service, not to heal others directly, but to embody wholeness so fully that others remember their own. And so the empath story is not tragic, but initiatory. What began as suffering ends as sovereignty. What began as dependency ends as divine participation. The narcissist, though unhealed, has fulfilled their mythic role. They have broken the empath's spell of self-forgetting, forcing the birth of a consciousness that no longer bleeds unconsciously for others. This is Jung's revelation. Every relationship that wounds us carries the blueprint of our awakening. The figures we call enemies are often the guardians of thresholds we would never cross voluntarily. The narcissist's cruelty becomes the key that opens the empaths locked in a room. Once the empath enters that room, they find not a victim but a god, the image of the self, luminous and complete. Waiting patiently through all the years of projection, to see oneself is to meet this inner divinity face to face, to realize that what one sought through others was always one's own essence, reflected in distorted form. The narcissist only mimicked divine radiance. The empath now embodies it. And this realization, unfelt, cannot be unfelt. It transforms perception forever. When the empath returns from the underworld of projection, they do not come back as they were. They return like one who has crossed fire and found that what burns also refines. The world around them has not changed yet. Everything has. The narcissist may still exist. The noise of others' desires may still beckon, but the empath's perception now arises from a different center. They no longer look outward for reflection. They see through what once appeared as manipulation, now reveals itself as suffering disguised as control. What once triggered them now calls forth understanding without surrender. The mirror is no longer a prison. It is a window. This is what it means to live as an individuated being, to walk in the marketplace with sacred eyes. For the empath, this return to the world is the final alchemical stage, the conjunctio, the union of heaven and earth, spirit and matter, compassion and clarity. They no longer speak of energy as something stolen or given, but as something danced between consciousnesses. Every encounter becomes symbolic, every conflict an invitation to balance. The narcissist archetype may still surface in others, but the empath now recognizes its presence as a reminder. Stay awake, stay centered, stay so ein. And it is no small task to embody light in a world still addicted to shadows, yet this is precisely what the awakened empath does. They do not escape life's density. They inhabit it with awareness. They feel pain without drowning, love without losing themselves, give without erasure. Their empathy is no longer porous, but radiant, not a sponge, but a sun. And this radiance is contagious. Others, unconsciously drawn to their coherence, begin to sense the possibility of wholeness within themselves. This is how transformation spreads, not by preaching, but by resonance. The healed empath becomes a field where other souls remember their own forgotten boundaries between illusion and truth. Jung once wrote that the gods have become diseases, meaning that what we once worshipped as divine forces now manifests as psychological symptoms. The narcissist is one such modern god, embodying humanity's obsession with image and validation, The empath's awakening is a small act of rebellion against that collective possession. To see oneself truly is to dethrone the false god of reflection and restore devotion to the self, that silent, eternal center from which love arises, not as sacrifice but as being. In healing themselves, the empath participates in restoring the divine order of the psyche. There will be days when the old ache returns, when the empath wonders whether it was all illusion, the love, the connection, the hope. But this too is part of integration, for the psyche does not erase history, it redeems it. To see oneself does not mean to forget the story, but to hold it differently as myth, as initiation, as the sacred path that led the soul back to its origin. The narcissist becomes an archetypal figure in that myth, no longer feared, but understood as a necessary antagonist of transformation. Without them, the empaths might never have discovered the power of saying, enough, I am whole. In dreams that follow awakening, the imagery changes once more. The empath may find themselves standing before a great ocean, its waves neither threatening nor inviting, but vast and still. Sometimes a figure appears, not the narcissist, not the wounded child, but the self-radiant and simple, speaking without words. The dreamer understands the ocean was never outside, it was the soul all along. To see oneself is to remember that there was never a division between giver and receiver, healer and healed, self and other. There was only consciousness exploring itself through the infinite mirrors of relationship. And so the empath walks forward, not in grand revelation, but in quiet knowing. They carry within them the memory of the mirror and the lesson of the wound. They speak less, but what they say carries weight. Their eyes, once clouded by longing, now see through appearances to essence. They do not seek to fix, to rescue, to be seen. They exist, and in their existence, others glimpse the possibility of existing fully. That is their gift, to be living evidence that love and awareness can coexist. That feeling deeply does not require losing oneself. That empathy can evolve from codependence to consciousness. The narcissist may never change. Some archetypes are slow to dissolve in the collective psyche, but the empath who has seen themselves has already changed the story. For every time awareness replaces projection, the world itself grows more transparent. The illusion of separation weakens. The empath's revelation becomes humanity's gradual awakening, the shift from emotional enslavement to spiritual autonomy. This is not utopia, but evolution, born one psyche at a time. In the end, the empath learns that love was never about merging, it was about mirroring divinity without distortion. True empathy sees without absorbing, loves without losing, understands without excusing. It holds space for others' suffering without abandoning the sanctity of one's own being. That is the balance of the self, the dance of opposites reconciled through consciousness. To see oneself is to stand in that center where shadow and light clasp hands, where the heart opens without leaking, where the soul knows it was never broken. So, if you have walked this path, if you have loved the narcissist and survived the shattering, do not regret it. You were chosen by the unconscious for this initiation. You were the vessel through which awareness entered suffering. You were the empath who mistook reflection for truth, until reflection broke and truth remained. And now, when you gaze into the mirror, you do not see the narcissist, nor the wounded child, nor the martyr. You see the self vast, patient, luminous, watching through your own eyes. That is Jung's revelation. Healing is not escape from darkness, but seeing it illuminated from within. The empath story is humanity's story, the return of the soul to its center after eons of projection. When the empath finally sees themselves, the world itself begins to remember its reflection in God,